We have another judge.
Oh, right. Let's just...
We might have to do
Okay, the Zoom is on, but Harper's not on the Zoom. Do you want to message Harper?
yeah.
It was a test, you guys passed.
Oh, we're muted. That's why she can't hear us.
Oh, is she Harper?
Hi, Harper. Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Welcome to round 5 of the New Zealand Schools Debating Championships. Congratulations to both teams for making it this far. The motion today is this House supports affirmative action for men in professions where they are significantly underrepresented. This looks like teaching, nursing, and social work. Speaking times are 7 to 8 minutes, with 1 clap at 1 minute and 1 clap at 7 minutes for POIs, 2 claps at 8 minutes for the end of your speech. Reply speeches are 4 minutes long, with 1 clap at 3 minutes and 2 claps at 4 minutes. And without further ado, I invite first up to start their team's case.
The stereotype of femininity exists to affirm masculinity as the dichotomy between strength and weakness. And by breaking down the construct of one, that necessarily results in the deconstruction of heteronormative sexuality. You break down these harmful stereotypes. 4 things in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to do some setup. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how we break down the stereotypes in these fields. Thirdly, I'm going to explain how we are able to voice out the needs of men in underrepresented and stigmatized areas. Lastly, on why women will not get overtaken and underrepresented in these fields. So firstly, on some setup then. 1, what does men's affirmative action actually look like? We think it's likely going to manifest through quotas in the workplace and quotas in schools and education, for example, in university degrees. Note here that the current landscape of these fields is that there is a significant underrepresentation of men. That is, like less than 10% of men are represented in nursing. But secondly, in terms of unions and the leadership structures of female-dominated industries, these union leaders are voted in by workers, and presumably in a female-led industry, as females workers want to vote in people who they think will accurately represent their needs, female leaders are probably going to take the positions of power. This means then that, you would vote in someone who you think is going to represent you very well, and female leaders are likely to promote female workers insofar as they care about representation as well. Or is that the female members of the union probably vote in men who are likely not misogynistic and able to represent them well and are not particularly discriminatory against women. But B is that people tend to climb up the ranks into leadership with experience. There are therefore just more women in the field, which means there are more women to promote. And what the setup does for our case, it explains to you why affirmative action schemes for men will not be discriminatory towards women or lock women out of positions of leadership, because I think that the unions are going to check and balance this, right? But thirdly, in terms of what the comparative is, I think they just need to support the status quo. There is no affirmative actions in these fields. We're happy to support maybe a net comparative of resources being reallocated to women. It is quite ineffective, but we're open to the comparatives that they might propose. Yes?
Don't you think that unions really only exist around pay inequity and don't help with promotions?
No, I don't think that's true. Okay, firstly, I'm going to talk about breaking down stereotypes. 1 is that men are underrepresented in these fields because of societal stereotypes. What do these stereotypes actually look like? It is the perception of social utility. That is, nursing is seen as less prestigious than, for example, being a finance bro because of notions of weakness, because of the need for nurturing and care in these industries like teaching. These stereotypes are particularly harmful for women because it impacts the way in which women are talked about in societal discourse, it impacts the way in which women are treated in these fields and how people view these fields as less socially utile. But B, in terms of the labels of men that go into these fields, are likely also going to be negative, because men who go into these fields are going to be perceived as weak and bring less social utility, because the majority of society is implicitly misogynist. We are all products of the patriarchy, which means then there are subconscious labels of femininity that are put into men on these fields, which diminishes their masculinity, diminishes their perception of strength in society, right? Note here that the stereotypes are being reproduced and planted subconsciously inherently into society because of things like confirmation bias, because society is repeatedly seeing women in these fields, and they therefore reproduce these negative stereotypes for the occupation as a whole. Secondly, how do we actually break down these stereotypes? One, when having more quotas for men, there are more men in these fields. I think it's pretty intuitive, and the mechanism for this is that this is a gradual process that lowers barriers for men wanting to go into this field. This means then men are going to be more incentivized to enter these fields because the tipping point between a man choosing between nursing and being a doctor is probably going to push them over the tipping point to choose nursing, because it means you're able to get into easier educational degrees. It means that you're easier able to get into the nursing industry in the first place, which means you get more men in these fields. But two, over time, society observes men entering these fields, right? This looks like going to the doctor and seeing a male nurse. This looks like having more male kindergarten teachers. This breaks down the stereotypes, and there's a shift in what people observe in these fields. This looks like viewing men as more capable of nurturing and pastoral care, viewing men as capable of providing good emotional support, which breaks down the stereotypes of men in society, traditionally being unable to experience emotions, being unable to communicate their vulnerability very well. But thirdly, is that when breaking down gender stereotypes, it also applies to women. Because of my intro, I explained to you how femininity affirms masculinity, because the dichotomy of strong strength and weakness, right? This means that if more men choose to go into female-dominated fields, you get less men in fields in engineering and comp sci, etc. And the femininity masculinity dichotomy is just proved to be societally false. This means that more women are going to enter more male-dominated fields. It's going to be viewed as something that is more commonplace, and is also just going to decrease the barriers for women in these fields in the first place. The outcomes of this are twofold. One is that society views female-dominated fields as more socially utile. This is the baseline that we're able to achieve in the first place. This is because stereotypes are broken on women, right? This is because some people will always be sexist and view men as more capable. That is going to be largely symmetric. But what the symmetricity does for our case, it explains to you how more men in these fields are going to mean that society is going to view these fields as more capable and worth entering. They observe women in these fields as therefore also very capable and also providing society a lot of utility. But secondly, in terms of a higher level, if society values these roles more, people buy into the feminist movement a lot more, because you have the feminist movement working with a lot of men in these female-dominated fields, right? Therefore, they join the feminist movement. You have more discourse around breaking down stereotypes around femininity and masculinity. You have better discourse of these fields and a better treatment and how society talks about women in nursing, right? But B, in terms of just a more amount of political support to push the needs of these industries. This looks like having higher amounts of support for things like increasing teacher and nurse pay. This looks like having better maternity leave conditions, right? Yes. Oh wait, no, I will not take that. Okay. Now then, I'm going to talk about how we're able to voice out the needs of men who are underrepresented or in stigmatized areas, right? The context here is that one, men and women face very different societal struggles because the female and the male experience is inherently different because of societally constructed stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. For example, boys in schools face incredibly different narratives to girls. For example, the idea that boys play sports or that boys don't cry, right? Or boys in foster care also just experience incredibly different types of abuse. But two, there's just massive stigma around men speaking up about certain topics. For example, in terms of men's mental health, or just very stigmatized topics of speaking up about being sexually assaulted, because it means you have to be vulnerable, because it means you have to break down the stereotypes of your masculinity and expose yourself to people who are probably going to be putting labels of strength on you, right? A few mechanisms here. One is that more men in these industries mean there's more knowledge and awareness and treatment of men's needs. For example, male teachers being able to understand and connect to younger boys, because more teachers in general just learning from that and adapting, right? But two is that more young boys feel able to speak up about their needs when they see the norms being broken down. And three, it is often just easier to speak to and as a young boy, it is often easier to speak to a male social worker because, for example, the male social worker has the lived experience of being a vulnerable teenage boy who struggles to speak up and show vulnerability, right? Comparatively, when you have a bunch of female social workers, I think a lot of young men in these industries or who are being exposed to this care just do not feel safe enough to speak up about things because the female social worker just does not share this sort of lived experience. The female social worker is viewed as someone who is inherently different and will not be able to understand you, which means that on the comparative, men are less likely to speak up about these issues. It stays stigmatized, which is particularly harmful because it is what is going to reinforce this notions of weakness and strength. Lastly, and briefly on why women do not get underrepresented in these fields. One, it's unclear how the male population of these industries will ever surpass female workers because it is already incredibly female dominated. But two, these industries and unions within them are still going to be led by women and voted on by women and filled by women. Like 10 men cannot just stampede this. And lastly, the government wants to make sure that women in these industries are happy. The feminist movement has a lot of lobbying. For all those reasons, I'm a proud feminist.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the next speaker to come to start the team's case.
That's always handy. So, you've got to trust the process, Riley. Trust the process. I think after 100 years of women being allowed to work, women being allowed to vote, women becoming people in society, we still have disadvantages out there. We still have reasons that we are not dominating in all these different fields. We still have reasons we are not equal, and that is why we are so proud to negate, because what we know is that we cannot be giving men more advantages over women when they are still so disadvantaged. 3 things in this debate. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on how affirmative action will work poorly for men in female-dominated fields. And thirdly, on why it will disadvantage women in the workplace. Now, I think firstly on setup. So now, first of all, I want to talk about the purpose of affirmative action. So this was to allow women to enter fields, healthcare, engineering, finance, places where, might I note, they are still so underrepresented. I think it's also important to note, like, how many female-dominated fields there are in comparison to male-dominated fields. Like, I think there are so many more male-dominated fields, especially the higher-paying ones, like engineering, healthcare, specialized healthcare especially. Like, we don't see females in here. What we see more so are these lower-paying roles, which we still think are important, but we want to be pushing women into these other roles. Now, secondly, I want to just talk about why these women weren't in there, why affirmative action came in. I think, first of all, there was less confidence. They personally had less confidence in themselves because there were so many barriers against them. Second of all, I think men were biased towards men. Like, men were still the ones who were in charge. They're more biased towards accepting someone into a role who looks like them, who talks like them, and someone they know will get the job done. I think, third of all, they are less likely to have support. Like, they are less likely to have support from their family, especially if you're in a conservative family. Less likely to have support from your partner to go and restudy and go into things like law or medicine. I think, third of all, society. Society just has pressures against women in general. I think also they face much more hostility in the workplace. Like, they get harassed by customers. There is a gender pay gap as well, even in these female-dominated fields, which I will go over a little bit more in the future. And I also talk about workplace relationships. Like, they are much more likely to get harassed by a co-worker, much more likely to be hurt and experience bad things in the
workplace. Now, this is exclusive to women. Now, I'd also like to point out, like, the fact why men don't face as much pressure, why there isn't affirmative action for men at the moment. I think, first of all, they've always been working. Like, there's that expectation that they will go into the workplace. Second of all, there are people in charge, the people put in charge of these roles are predominantly men, even in female-dominated roles. For example, like managerial and further study roles, like the big people at the top, they are male. Most principals are male. Heads of departments, heads of nursing faculties, males. The people who go into postgraduate studies, males. We heard at the quiz night last night that most doctors in the UK are females, but that's because they're told not to go and specialise, not told to go and take the extra step. That's because they're stuck in that spot, told to settle down, take what you've got, and start a family. Like, I think this is horrible on the affirming side of the house. Like, I also think they don't face as many systemic pressures, and they're also favoured by employers and recruiters. So again, I would just like to talk about these female-dominated professions. Again, like teaching and nursing, they are seen as more feminist roles, but they are pushed in there by society. Like, a lot of them aren't really there by choice. Like, I think that a lot of them are just told, oh, nursing would be a good career for you, or, oh, you do a good teacher, you're really empathetic. Like, I think that's horrible, and I think we should be breaking down those barriers before, breaking down the tiny barriers that men face. And I would just like to say that, these people are in managerial and further study roles because it is just basic fact that they do face all these systemic pressures, and I don't think affirming can tell me that they don't. Yes.
The rat is a lot different than the lion. By showing that the lion creates tend as the rat, do we not challenge the stereotypes and close the gap that allows the rat to be the strongest alive?
We're talking about humans here, not animals. Now, I would just like to go on to... I'd like to go on to my point about how this will be badly done. Now, what do men in these fields who go into these fields look like? I think there are two categories. I think, first of all, there are people who are empathetic, like basically empathetic men, people who do enjoy these roles. They care about wanting to help students, or they want to be a social worker to help people. They genuinely care, first of all. I don't think they're being forced into these fields. Second of all, I think they kind of understand the struggles of women. I think many of them are feminists by nature, especially because they work with a lot of females. I think, third of all, they don't face the pressure to be employed. Note, they don't face they do face social pressure as everyone does, but I want to tell you that they will be employed. It's not like they will just say, oh no, we'll turn you away. I think they're more likely to get employed, especially because, again, these people in managerial positions, the people hiring, they are male. I think, second of all, the second category that we have are people who want to take leg up advantages. They want to take advantage of the fact that they know that they can get in there. They know that it's a female-dominated field, and they see women as weak and inferior, and that they can get in and take a leg up. They can get into these high managerial positions, and they will face little pressure to get in there. So men in general, what social pressures do they face? Because this has been a big push on affirming. Now, I think they face the pressure instead to be the man, to work for their own, and make a legacy around themselves. Like, I think they face genuine pressure to leave something behind after they go. So I don't think they face pressure to get into the work again, but I think they have a pressure to make a name for themselves. Like, I don't think they face as much of a pressure anymore to be empathetic and, to not be empathetic and gentle. Like, I think this does exist, but I don't think it's as big anymore, especially because of the big things that the LGBTQ movement has done, for example. AF says they face social pressure to go into these roles. Now, a few things on this. Firstly, again, we tell you that it is to make a name, to make a legacy. That's why they do pursue a lot. Second of all, we think that they also more prefer traditional male roles, quite a few of them, especially with the ultra-trad male kind of movement that we have going on at the moment, which is a lot more popular. So I don't see how affirming is going to undo this whole movement. And even if their argument relies on breaking barriers with quotas, so they will still face social pressure on the affirming side of the house if you buy that. So they will still face so much pressure, which I think is enormous and paramount. So why are they likely to get in, even if we do give you quotas? And then now, with affirmative action, we will push men out who care. I think, first of all, they will face more stigma because they don't feel like they're getting a leg up. They're like, oh, you're just given this role because you're a man. I don't think this is going to be helpful towards them. I think this is also unique to men, as only they face this, legacy and success pressure. And I think it also damages their masculinity, which I think is important to them. I think, second of all, the good people will also feel bad, people who have a little bit more empathy, as they did choose to go into these roles, and they're more likely to be, feminists, or at least allies of the feminist movement, so they're going to feel bad for these people. So I think we're also likely to see that these people will take a step down and be like, no, I don't want to do this, I don't want to be, pushing women out of the roles. So I think the impact of this is that, first of all, men will feel shamed for being here, so I think because they'll have a damaged image, I also think it's going to be bad for their mental health. So I think what we're going to see is actually less men in these fields, or at least bad mental health of these people in these fields. I think, second of all, we're left with men who are only there to take advantage, to take advantage of that male hierarchy, and I think that's really bad and poor for these roles. Now, I think, second of all, moving on to my point on disadvantage, so even if you don't buy our first point, we still have to win on this. I think, first of all, I would just like to point out there's more pressure on women than men to work. Ooh. I've went, oh, whoops. Now, I've outlined this in setup why men face a lot more pressure than women, and I've also said that they are less likely to work, they're less likely to be specialised and promoted. So what does this mean that affirmative action in men's does? So I think this, first of all, takes away resources from women's. You know, this takes out the quotas that they're getting, the scholarships that they're getting, to feel confident that they might actually get a role. And that moves me on to my second mechanism. Like, they will have less confidence, so it already takes a lot to bite the bullet and exist in what could be a hostile training and work environment. You know, with harassment and men in charge, they feel supported under the status quo. If we remove this, we have the less go girl, you can do it. We have less support for these women, and removing this like little safety net is going to be a really big harm to them. Like, it's going to be less likely that they'll go into these fields because they feel less likely, less confident that they'll get into these roles. They feel less likely that they'll be able to get up there and actually try and make a difference and try and dominate in these fields. I think, third of all, we also see more men in there. We see less favour towards women. Like, I think AF cannot remove inherent male bias in the workplace in the near future. No, males still tend to be in charge in these positions. So therefore, the men coming in will be favoured. Now, this means that women will be a lot more disadvantaged, and we should care about them more because that's the people that we're trying to impact with affirmative action. So I think three main impacts of this. First of all, they feel less supported. Second of all, there's more competition. And third of all, there's less women in these roles. There's a finite amount of jobs in this. So even if you can prove to me that, there's still a finite amount of jobs. So we will take away roles from women. In a world when women are so disadvantaged, we do not want to add to that. That's why I'm so proud to negate.
So thank the speaker for their speech, and invite the next speaker to come up and continue their team's case.
Negating cannot claim that on one hand men face zero stereotypes in society, but on the other hand they're influenced by the ultra-trad movement. This necessarily contradicts themselves. What is more likely is what is the very intuitive idea, which is that all people in society face pressure and that gender is a massive part of society and constructs the way we go about life. I think it's very fair to say that the patriarchy impacts both men and women. Men are definitely impacted by this. They cannot claim that men are these invincible beings that face no stereotypes in society. This is very uncharitable. A couple things in the speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how women in these industries are going to be. Secondly, about how men in these industries are going to be. Thirdly, about these supposed stereotypes that men do or do not face in the status quo. And then lastly, I'm going to go on my split about how we help men who don't conform to heteronormative masculinity. Okay, firstly about how women in these industries are going to be, because they tell you a couple things here. Their first push here is that women are already disadvantaged, and therefore this is going to be really bad because it's going to take attention and resources away from women as a whole in society. A couple things here. One, I want to note that I think the way that this is actually going to be implemented in the status quo is going to be very different to what they tell you. Because how is this actually going to look? Because it's not going to look like buses constantly driving around saying get men in nursing, men are nurses, right? What it's going to look like is this quota existing, that people knowing about it, it's probably going to make the news one time, and then it's probably going to be the people who are in these industries or in these university courses or planning to get into it who are going to know about this, right? What this means then is that it's not going to be such a massive shift to the point at which women feel as though they're being kicked out of these areas, right? But then two, we tell you that there's massively strong countervailing narratives that still give women that representation. The feminist movement, as they tell you, is incredibly strong, right? The feminist movement, I think, is one of the most well-known social movements. People know about this, and I think the general public are aware, at least on a surface level, that yes, women do face discrimination, and yes, this is why we have feminist movement, this is why we have quotas in other industries for women, right? What this means then is that I think it's very unclear to why this is going to impact women to the point at which they feel like they are so disadvantaged in these areas, right? Then I think three, even if you want to believe that women are I think women are disadvantaged in other areas, but I think we give you tons of reasons at Lucy why we actually break down these norms and why this is really good, right? Because note that I think the best place to have this debate is within Western liberal democracies, right? Because that's where you have the biggest potential to make this change, where you have these courses and capacity to have these quotas, right? What this means then is that note that in the wave of feminism that we're in the Western world,
world, it is mostly about the breaking down of norms. Because women have like political equality, women have like legal rights, right? What is left to do is to break down the norms and the societal beliefs that actually shape women's experience on the daily, right? Because note that in the legal system, women are allowed to go for it, women are allowed to go into whatever job they want. So why don't we see this? Because we have these like norms, we have this patriarchy that is forming us, right? The way to break that down is to break that down from both sides. We have the feminist movement working to break it down on the women's side. I think it's fair to say that if you have it working from the other side, if you eat away from a rope from both ends, you are going to make a far better difference. You are going to be able to impact both sides of this. The second push here is that men are in charge of these industries. They're going to favor men, and men are more likely to get employed. A couple things here. One, note that like employing somebody is not just like one dude at the top making a decision, right? It is a board of people deciding who to employ, deciding who to promote. What this means then is that we give you tons of mechanisms why women are more likely to rise up through the ranks, because unions are like voted by women, and therefore the people in charge are voted by the predominantly female workers, right? Why you have to have experience in the area, and because women are like within this area, it's just more likely you're going to see more women rising to the top. They never respond to these mechanisms. They cannot simply assert that, oh, because it's a managerial position, men have to be in that, right? I think that in these industries, which are led by women, I think it's just very intuitive that women are in charge here, right? So therefore, these checks and balances will exist, that even if there is a male employer, they are going to be checked and balanced by like the rest of the board, right? And then two, notice that like the men at the top of these industries, even in their absolute best case, right? If their men are at the top of these industries, they have to have like risen up through the works. Like they didn't just randomly get employed, right? That means a man, like a male nurse who's like the head of the nursing department, has to have like gone through nursing school, has to have like become a nurse, has to work decades within the nursing industry. These are not your misogynistic men who are just like hiring any single man they see. These are the men who have worked with women, who have studied with women, who have lived every single day surrounded by a team of women who understand what women experience. But two, these are the men who necessarily went against the misogynistic norms, who went against him or her normative masculinity. These are the men who said, no, I will not be like these other men. No, I believe that these are utile jobs, that women who are in these careers are just as competent as men who are in engineering. These are the men who went against that. It is very unclear why these men are going to be so misogynistic. But then even at our very worst, where these men are so misogynistic, notice that it's just symmetric, because women in these like industries in the status quo must already then feel like they can't rise up. It is very unclear why this changes. If when men are at the top, women feel like they can't rise up, then when men are already at the top, why can women feel like they rise up now? We tell you this just doesn't exist, and even at our best, it's symmetric. Even at their worst, it's symmetric. Okay, lastly here they tell you that women get resources and support taken away from them. They don't feel as confident going in. I think you can just sense check this. Like a quota of 20% doesn't make people feel like they're not going to get in, right? Like we have quotas in other university degrees. We have like Māori and Pacific quotas in like the medical degree, right? This doesn't make white people feel like they can't go and become doctors, right? That's not how it works. Because women predominantly already face these narratives that like pressure them to go into these industries. They're told they are very like emotional. They're told they're good at this. These narratives are far stronger than this one quota, right? Then also I think you can just like note that women like aren't stupid. They're going to be like, oh, well, 80% of like the industry is still open for me to get into. Women who go into these very hard degrees already believe that they can get into it. This is just like very uncharitable push. Therefore, I think what you should believe at the end of this point is that we actually help women outside of the house because we break down these stereotypes, and the women in these industries get better worker rights because they're working with men. The feminist movement is attached to more men. We just get far more positive material on our side of the house. Secondly, on men in these industries. And I tell you a couple of things here. Firstly, men are going to take advantage of this, and they're just going to use it to get a leg up. And like, okay, I think this is just like very easily sense checkable. Like, if you're going to become a nurse, you have to go to nursing school for like 5 years at least, right? And then you have to like, go work on this for decades. You're not going to do it just because like, oh, I think this is an easier way to get employed. There are many easy ways to get employed. They tell you by their own analysis that men have it easier going into these into other industries, right? If that's true, then why would men choose to go into an industry that is necessarily shamed by society unless they believe that it is like a good thing, unless they believe that they can actually do good in there, unless they believe that it's utile. And if they believe that, then we just say that our side of the house is clearly working, and we clearly give you analysis that is correct because men are beginning to see this as more utile, right? The men who go into this are not just going in to take advantage, they actually care. That is what you do when you work a job for decades. Then they tell you that men are going to feel like they're giving a leg up, and they're going to feel shamed. I think this is just not how quotas generally impact people, right? Note that we see quotas in the status quo as in like the Māori and Pacific quota, right? I think most people going into this because they genuinely understand, and like usually when these quotas are given, there's given lots of explanation to the public and justification for them, right? This means that when this explanation is given, I think generally people understand that, oh yes, men in these industries probably face a worse time. Therefore, this is just an easy way to get in, right? But note that they cannot claim that one, men are going to take advantage of this, but two, men are going to feel shamed because they feel like they're given a leg up, right? I think neither of these things are true. I think what's largely true is that men probably like have brains and agree that like, oh, less men in this industry, men representation good, equality good, therefore I should get into this industry because that's pretty good, right? I don't think we're here near enough to like claim why men are going to feel so instantly shamed when that is not what we see in the status quo when quotas are there. Lastly then, they tell you that men don't face stereotypes not to be emotive, but then they tell you that men have the ultra chat movement. I think I already deal with this, I don't need to go over this again. Men do face stereotypes. Okay, lastly then I'm going to go on to my split, because my split is how we help men who don't conform to heteronormative masculinity, right? Because note that it's not just men in the future that will buy out of this ideal, right? Men already exist in the status quo who don't feel like they conform to that men don't feel emotions, who don't feel like they're a part of that like ultra chat ideal, right? These look like men who are like queer, right? Men who are part of the LGBTQ movement. But these just look like normal men who don't feel like they want to go and join the army and like take up guns and start shooting people, right? These look like men who like generally like value the utility of like being a nurse, or like generally like think that teaching is cool, right? They like taught their friends something in school and they're like, hey, maybe I actually do like teaching. Maybe this is cool. The comparative is, right, on their side of the house, when you've never had a male teacher, you don't see that as even like an option for you. You don't see that as like a realistic career path. But when the classroom you were sitting in is a male teacher, when like 20 of your teachers throughout your life have been male, that is incredibly powerful. That shifts, that is the tipping point for when a man feels like maybe I can actually do this, maybe this is a respectable career path, this is something I can achieve, this is incredibly impactful, you need to care about this. In order to have equality in society, you need to care about both men and women.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the next speaker to come and continue leading space.
If a lion starts to nibble at the end of a rope on one end, it scares away the mouse devouring the other. A couple of questions in my speech today. Firstly, what is a better alternative that we can support? And note this will be my substantive contribution. Secondly, how would AF's model actually affect stereotypes? Thirdly, how does it affect women? And finally, on how this will affect men. So now, firstly, what is a better option that we can support? Now note, this is mutually exclusive as there is only so much capital when it comes to things such as affirmative action. So, we would actually support more affirmative action for women. Now, note, this is obviously better for women, but I'll focus more on how it will increase the proportion of men in these jobs, in these jobs such as teaching, as this, I think this engages the most with AF's case. So, why would this happen? Well, firstly, I think we can agree society has forced men into the role of making money and being like leaders, as this has lasted since the era of the patriarchy, since the patriarchy was first established, and this continues through to today. And secondly, women have been forced into these jobs, such as teaching, such as social work, through by society, and they've deemed these jobs fit for women. Society has forced women out of business, out of trades, out of engineering, and into these jobs. So, I think if we focus on pushing women into these more male-dominated fields that they have historically been excluded from, if we break down these gender norms to saying that women are as good as men, and we focus on shifting society's perspective around women, they will naturally gravitate to some degree away from teaching, nursing, and social work. And this will increase the proportion of men in these workforces. Furthermore, this will have the secondary impact of reducing the pressure on men to join these jobs, as these jobs will no longer be portrayed as feminine, which will have a compounding effect, and this will help equalize the proportion of men in these workforces. If we push women into fields like STEM, if we push women into fields like business, this means that these fields are no longer associated with men, and this means that the other fields such as teaching will no longer be associated with women. So what are the impacts of this? I think they're twofold. Well, firstly, I think on our side of the house, we clearly have better outcomes for women if we focus more on affirmative action for women, and I think these are the people who have been discriminated against the most in society, who are the most disadvantaged, and are thus the most important stakeholders. And secondly, I think we do get more men in the workforce on our side of the house just because we actually break down these gender norms better, and I think this essentially allows us to co-opt a lot of AF's impacts, and this will help us, and this lets us help men without actually harming women. So now on to how will this actually affect stereotypes. I think I'd like you to note that AF's second and third points are largely contingent on stereotypes actually being broken down on their side of the house. So I think if we can prove that they're not, I think AF is left with actually very little substantive material that you can credit. So, what if they told you, I think their case, once you unravel all their jargon, pivots on more men in these jobs due to quotas, and these men being seen in these jobs, and this will break down gender stereotypes. I think this is essentially like their underlying mechanism. I think all of their further impacts and mechanisms sort of like rely on these like gender norms being broken down through more men being in these jobs. So I think we tell you a few things in response. Well, firstly, if you believe that these stereotypes can be changed, then I think our alternative just does it better. If we do put more capital into affirmative action for women, I think this just breaks down the gender stereotypes better. Now, why is this? Well, I think it's because women are the ones who are actually discriminated against. So if we do put more affirmative action into putting them into these fields that they aren't in, like STEM, like business, I think this breaks down norms much better than helping men into fields which they already have large numbers of access to. I think secondly, as AF has taken an extremely soft stance in this debate, I think this has really destroyed the path to the ballot. I think quotas, in AF's best case, lead to a very moderate increase in the number of men. I think their impacts are actually extremely limited by this. I don't think a 20% quota, as all the affirmative action that they propose, is actually going to have a large impact. And thirdly, I think that quotas just won't actually increase the number of men in these fields, even to a moderate degree. Now, why is this? Well, I think the purpose of quotas is to allow those who are discriminated against to enter a workforce. For example, it would allow women to enter workforces which have prejudices against them. It would allow women to enter things such as trades, where those who are in charge of trades would typically not hire women. So it's like when the society doesn't want like the employer to hire the employee, quotas force the employer to hire such said employee. I think there's just no real barriers to entry for men that these quotas would overcome. I think the limiting factor is the number of men who want to do these jobs, and quotas don't really change this. I think if we heard from AF a case more about like pushing through like flyers, posters, etc., about how men actually can go into these workforces, I think it's been a much better case for them to run. And I think since they have essentially limited the scope down to purely quotas in their first week and continue through in their second, I think this is what they have to stick with. So I think what this actually looks like is 20% of teachers are already men. I think the limiting factor, once again, is the number of men who want to go into the workforce. I think if a man wants to become a teacher, wants to become a social worker, wants to become a nurse, I think they just can. I don't think there is actually really any barriers that stop them from doing this that quotas will actually eliminate. So I think they don't actually get any real change on their side, except a less affirmative action for women, which means less women in STEM, which means that these gender norms are actually reinforced on their side of the house. So now, how will this affect women? And once again, note, I think this is the main stakeholder of this debate, because once again, women are the ones who are most disadvantaged. I think both houses can agree that there is a patriarchy, and while this might negatively affect men to some degree, I think this does just, quite factually, I think this intuitively affects women to a much larger degree. So we've told you that this will take away resources from women, and I think one of AF's main responses to this was that, narratives are stronger than quotas, so women will still join these jobs. And I think if narratives are stronger than quotas, as their second speaker quite literally said, then once again, quotas are going to have no real change on their side of the house. They won't actually change the narrative if the narrative is stronger than quotas. And this gives another mechanism as to why their house doesn't actually make any marginal change, why their side of the house doesn't actually change anything. So I think, and secondly, we tell you that women will just be less supported, because once again, there is a limited contingent amount of capital when it comes to things such as affirmative action. So I think on our side of the house, even if it is to a marginal degree, I think you just do have more women in jobs such as STEM. I think it's such a huge impact, as this actually does help us to break down gender stereotypes, which is once again what the whole entire case is contingent on. And before I reach 7 minutes, I'll take a POI if you have any.
Why do you break down stereotypes when you introduce women into STEM when that's already very...
Well, why do we break down, well, okay, let's say STEM, for example, was an example. I also said stuff such as trades, such as engineering, that are male-dominated. And once again, I think if you, their mechanisms are essentially, if you introduce a gender into a job that's typically stereotyped against that gender and being that's typically stereotyped against that gender in that job. I think that breaks down the gender stereotypes. I think that's essentially the underlying mechanism. And now they're saying that if we introduce women into, say, engineering, that suddenly won't actually have an impact. However, I think if you do just see more women in engineering, that will obviously have an impact, because it means that these norms are being broken down. And I think you have to believe this to a certain degree, as AF themselves have essentially told you, that if you see more of a gender in a job, it will break down these stereotypes. Now briefly onto how this will affect men. So I think we hear from AF that once again this will help men. However, once again, I think this is essentially purely contingent on stereotypes actually being broken down, which I think we've proven that they won't actually be due to quotas being such a marginal change. So how this will actually affect men is that men in these industries will be seen in a more negative light. Why is this? Well, even though they might not get into it due to affirmative action, there is this negative connotation around affirmative action. I think oh, you got into that job just because you're a man now. You got into teaching just because you're a man. So I think this is quite negative. And even though this is a small negative impact for men, I think this negative mental health impact is still a larger impact than essentially no change for men there's on our side of the house. So if you fight for better women's rights, if you fight for better men's mental health, you fight for side negating. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the next speaker to come and continue their express.
It does not matter if men actually enter these industries to a great amount. It does not matter if you actually get all of the men in these industries. Our model was never contingent on this. We told you at first and down the line that it just matters that men feel like they can be in these areas. That is enough to break the stereotypes, because they feel like they can be caring, that you break that tipping point of the men who want to be. Those are the people that change. It does not matter if men on a whole actually do. It was never contingent on that. They can never claim that. They never dealt with our actual core, that you just break stereotypes in the very first place. It was never contingent. I'm going to deal with 3 questions in this speech. First on the stereotypes themselves around these gender roles and how that is enough to win us, this debate. And then I'm going to win on their ground and extend our margins by talking about the practical on women in these industries and how that changes and how it changes for men in these industries. I don't think it's that important, because they never told us why these outcomes are necessarily more important than the woman that they tell us are so vulnerable, so I don't think you should weigh that highly anyway. But let's be very clear just before I start this, because they tried to bring out a model at second. I think in the very first place that's far, far too late. They can't just claim that they now get affirmative action in the other way. But I think secondly, affirmative action for women in these industries is already happening because they tell us that these women are so vulnerable and that they need so much help. There is already affirmative action in place that didn't solve the issues that they tried to tell us about. But I think secondly, that it doesn't fix the core that these men now think that these women are gain advantage in these industries, and therefore you necessarily break down all the outcomes that they wanted to claim on that never happened. Now onto these stereotypes about gender roles and how these change. Because we told you, they told you that was contingent that men actually join, and that's the only way we can break these stereotypes. Well, we told you if you're a youth, if you're going into education, and you are now given the chance, and you're told that men can be a teacher, you can be a nurse, you can be caring, you're now breaking those stereotypes that men can only be things like engineers, they can only be hard, they can only be hyper-masculine. You were breaking those in the very first place. We also told you that there's a dichotomy that by breaking down the stereotypes around men, then women feel like they can as well, because if men aren't all engineers, then maybe women are engineers as well. But also just because if more men are entering these areas of feminist, in more primarily female industries, then there are more gaps in the male-dominated ones for women. That means that there's more gaps. That is enough to also do more. Their next big claim is that this perception. Their next big claim, though, is that there's a perception that men need help and that not women. But we told you that there are very strong countervailing narratives from feminists, and that if you buy all their analysis that females are so disadvantaged, it was never enough to actually mean that now men feel disadvantaged and that doesn't change in society. We tell you that the stereotypes still remain, that we break them down, the dichotomy exists. I think this is really important for a few reasons. Because firstly, on the very ground level, we show people, regardless of any contingencies, that men can be teachers, you can be a nurse. I think this is really good though, because firstly, we just win on scale here, because notice that they try to focus on women the most, but we help women and men. Our case was never only about men because of the dichotomy that we told you at first. They never even engaged with that at all. That was enough. You should care about the scale here because we help their stakeholders as well, but also on vulnerability, because if you care about these women so much as they told you, we win here. I think though, in our very worst case, let's get on the ground level, because even if we get 1% of men, they can never take down our whole case. The best they can do is mitigate. We get at least one more man on our side in these areas. That is so important, because it looks like a male student being in a class and realizing my teacher is male, maybe I can as well. You break down that perception. That is enough. It was never contingent. That means in the long term, even if we only have 1 more percent, that is enough to break down the stereotypes. They could never take down this path. The best they could do is mitigate and mitigate. Now, before I move on to their path and breaking them down, how we actually went on them as well, I'll take that point.
If you don't need to break down norms, but you instead have to allow men to feel they can enter these roles to win, what is the difference between those two goals?
I'm going to move on to men in my last point and prove that we actually do get more. I'll flag where I respond to that directly. Now on to women in these industries, because they tell you that women become overwhelmed, that these quotas will go too far, and that men will dominate them to a great degree. But we already told you at Krisha, and you have this in your notes, that firstly, they never proved the tipping point on why you go from 10 to 20% to a significant amount. They never did the mechanistic work. Because if you buy the material that men don't probably enter anyway to a great extent, that's a knife, and it can never exist on both sides. They have to only take one. But I think secondly, we told you that there are pre-existing women in leadership and unions in the government, because the kind of world in which this is enacted is when if you buy that these fields are female dominated, then the people in the government that necessarily care about them are also females. These are the people where you actually get that care. You get a lot of backlash if it's done badly. But I think thirdly, we told you that the kind of men moving are on the tipping point, because obviously there are countervailing narratives that mean that not all men move. But I think that means necessarily then the amount that moves is not that much. You don't get suddenly all of the men in the world wanting to become teachers. You never overwhelm them to that extent. But then fourthly, even if you buy that they do, they told you in their first speech, and note this, that the kind of men that move are people like feminists and people that care about women to a great extent. It was very unclear why these men probably wouldn't actually help the workforce when they get more support from men themselves. That's a good thing, because if you get such a significant amount of men, it's actually good for these women if you buy their characterization of what they actually look like. The next claim is on the practical, where you get decreased resources for women. But I already proved to you just then why it's not overwhelming. You have that. But I think even if you buy that you get a significant amount of men, I don't think it's I don't think it's that bad, because firstly, if you buy that men run society to a great extent and that they are so biased, if you get more men in these areas, then men start to care about them more, you get more funding, if they are seen as more utile, they're seen as more important, and more people care about them. That means for the women in these industries, they get more care, they get more support, we win on them as well, because men have that bias by their analysis. But I also think if men move into the more primarily women-dominated jobs, then there are gaps in the men's that women can fill. I think it works both ways. It's not necessarily that they're just shunned out of jobs at all. There are others in society. I think that's really important because we think we care about the women the most. These are the most vulnerable people, but also that was the metric they wanted to win on. They didn't do it sufficiently, we did. Now onto the men, because they had this push that men have such bad mental health, and this is so bad. But I think let's first deal with their contradicting statement, because they told you that there's a limiting factor for men that means that you're not going to have that many joining anyway. I'll note at the top of this that it is mitigatory, and therefore it's not enough to take it down completely. But also, they tried to tell you that women are overwhelmed. It's not good enough for them to claim that both no men will move, but also they'll move so much that women are so disadvantaged, both can't stand. I think firstly though, let's note though, that we told you that narratives get changed. The thing that's stopping a man that wants to be a teacher is the fact that everyone is told that you have to be the breadwinner, you have to make the most money. They can't be in these areas in the first place because of that from a very young age by all of their analysis. But I think we also told you that the shift is not that big. It looks like a doctor now becoming a nurse because they realize how important it is, and now they can because they have that incentive, but also because stereotypes in general are getting changed and there's no pressure for them to not be. Now onto bad mental health. They told you that these men in these areas feel less masculine because of this affirmative action and they're just getting it in by advantage. But I think you have to either buy that these people gain it in are feminists or they're so misogynistic that it's very bad. But in either case, this doesn't stand, because if you buy the feminists, they probably think it's a good thing that you have like benefits for women, as we told you down the line, that you're breaking down these stereotypes. Therefore, if they care about it so much, their mental health is probably better. But if you buy the misogynists, they're so biased, they think they got in on their own grounds and the advantage, they were just so good anyway, it doesn't matter, their mental health is no worse off. I think at the end of the speech, we're not contingent. We either break down the stereotypes in the very first place, but in our worst case, we can win on all the metrics they tried to claim. On the practical, we win for both men and women. We're feminists.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite the next speaker to come up and continue their team's case.
Clear mischaracterization of what the most important thing for the feminist movement is. It isn't making sure there are no misogynists in the world. It isn't making sure that there aren't people who hate women, because that is such an ingrained issue that we're probably going to have that for generations and generations to come. The most important issue to the feminist movement is making sure that women can succeed in the most way possible. I think it's very important to characterize how recent the social progression of women is. Only 50 years ago, women couldn't have a credit card without their husband. Making sure that women have the ability to access affirmative action to go into positions they have never been able to get into before is incredibly important. And you lose a large amount of the money that is put towards that if you side with side affirming. And if you care about feminism, like they have said in every single one of their speeches, you simply cannot side with their house. Firstly, on the points of clash of the improvements of these fields. They have said generally some points on workers, and I will go over those first. Firstly, they've talked about managerial, and I think let's talk about why it's important to talk about women in these managerial spaces, because that's how you can control the workload for you, your peers, and as both sides have agreed, even with this affirmative action, there are going to be more women in them. But when you introduce this affirmative action, you are inherently going to have more men in this. Why is this? They've tried to tell you a couple of reasons why there isn't going to be bias in this process. They said, oh, well, you have to be controlled by nurses, and that's who's doing this. And I think that's clearly misunderstanding, like, in general, how promotions work. It's not the people you work with who decide your promotions, it's the upper management. And upper management is often not tied with these fields. It is tied with more prestigious positions that are more biased towards men. So on average, the people running these positions are going to be on men. And what does this look like? Well, both sides have agreed that there is bias towards men in the world, so that they're going to be more likely to choose a man over a woman. And even if they've said that it's important to have men in these fields, just having more men in this means that there's more likely to be biased towards men. A good man is always going to be seen as equal as an exceptional woman. So if we are seeing okay to good to maybe mediocre men getting these positions over exceptional women, I think that is clearly unfeminist. And they said that they win on improving these gender relations. And I think you cannot do that if what your case does, frankly, promotes misogyny in the workplace. Secondly, on workers, they have said that this will make these less prestigious fields feel more prestigious because there are men in them. And I frankly think that's untrue for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we both agree that there's a misogynistic viewpoint. So why won't they view it in a misogynistic way? I think if we live in a society, just because something may seem progressive to a progressive audience doesn't mean that's how it's going to be viewed in the media. I think how it's more likely to be viewed by this misogynistic people, they say we're going to change their opinions, is like, oh, look at these terrible women doing these terrible jobs. They've had all these strikes. They've had all this complaining. And what have they decided to do to fix this? Bring in men. That's a good decision. It doesn't make the field look prestigious. It looks like the woman in it will be mistreated more by those misogynistic people who come in, that they will ask to not get treated by them and treated by the men who are now in those fields. And so these women will have less chances to succeed in these fields. And let's talk about those seeking care in these industries. They've said that to feel connection with someone, you have to see someone who is like you. And I think that's frankly untrue. You don't feel connection because someone is like you. You feel connection because someone cares about you. And to say that only someone who knows what you're going through it can care about you is just frankly a very biased way to look at the world. You care about someone because you're an empathetic person, because you want to be seen. And even if you think seeing someone like you is so important, both sides know that there are just men in their field. There's male teachers, there is male nurses, there's male all of these things. And if the only reason that these men aren't going into these fields is because they don't see any male nurses or male teachers, then why haven't they seen the male teachers and male nurses that they exist and more going into it? I don't think a small gradual increase is really going to do anything towards it. And have we pointed out all the negatives that will come associated and the increasingness of misogyny? You cannot buy any of the case around that. Before I move on, I will take a POI.
What claims is true that no men will move because the limiting factors also already met, or that so many will move that females are harmed?
There's not, what we're saying here is we don't believe that there is going to be a large amount of men going into this field. But as we pointed out, the increase of men who often aren't going in, as we have characterized the men who do go in, who are morally correct, who want to care about women, they're just doing it because either they're kind of like misogynistic and want to kind of stick it to these women that they can do better to them, or they're just doing it because they're like, well, there's a quota to be met, so I'm more likely to get into this position, so we're not getting more equal men. And secondly, on gender relations. Firstly, they've said, like, this will help with negative stereotypes to do with men, which I think is kind of a strange claim, because honestly, when you're going into a nurse's office, you're not like, how many men and how many women are in here? Let me take a second to look at that, and that's going to really change my perspective on how I should react when I've been sexually assaulted as a man. That's a very strange connection, and I think if they wanted to make that more clear, they should have more clearly mechanized it with it. But I think what we should talk about is how that's going to react in the general media. They say, oh, there isn't going to be a big push on this. There's going to be one media story. story. And I think that is a very confusing way to look at a world that is always, that at the moment we have an extreme culture war. As we have already brought up the manosphere, I think what you're going to see from people like this who always love chasing their stories, that what they're going to be pushing out is like this woke agenda, that all of these things are pushing men to do more of a feminine role. And I don't think that's actually going to make men who are already kind of misogynistic, who I think we can agree are the ones who are also affected by those stereotypes, who probably watch these creators. It's not going to make them think more about maybe these stereotypes are untrue. It's going to make them go more strongly into these beliefs and think less critically, as they're like, everything in my world is telling me to not be what I want to be, which is strong and masculine, and they're actually going to get worse outcomes for men's mental health on their side of the case. And they said that like also just like breaking down stereotypes is incredibly important on a like general sense with these jobs. And I still think like the idea that men can just like still be nurses, I think doctors, not doctors, teachers and all this stuff exists on our side of the house. We're just saying that we can't be increasing this through the metrics they've talked about because of all of the problems that it will face for other people in these fields. But also, yeah. Anyways, moving on to a very small and strange point they made about like LGBTQ plus men, or men not feeling this, feeling strongly connected to masculinity, feeling more able to connect this. I think that's kind of just like you're putting a hat on a hat in terms of stereotypes. I feel like misogynistic people are going to be worse to them because they're like, one, you're a gay person, and two, you're going to a job which, as someone who doesn't like the idea of quotas because you're kind of misogynistic and don't want think that worldview of everyone being equal, you're just going to think that these are kind of lazy gay guys who are going into this because it's easier, and you're actually going to make stereotypes towards them worse. I think in this case, you can either care about like a misogyny and how it affects women, or you can care about the workload and stuff like that. And we won on misogyny, as we've proved. It will one be worse for men, the women in this field, as they will be more affected by these stereotypes. We have two proved to you how it will be worse for stereotypes in general, as there will be higher polarization in the media. And we thirdly proved that the people getting these higher up positions who are working to make this world better will most likely not be the most effective for these cases. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to negate.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and as a tradition, we will now reverse speaking order, so I invite the leader of the negating party to come up and continue their case.
When a team limits the scale of a debate to a 20% quota for men, they cannot claim from this extremely marginal change that the dichotomy of gender stereotypes will break down. I implore you to just have a simple sense check here. The patriarchy has existed from essentially the beginning of the human race, yet this 1% increase in male teachers will suddenly be the tipping point. Frankly, I think that even the unreasonable average person wouldn't believe this. I think that there's no single person that's going to believe that this extremely marginal change is suddenly going to be this tipping point that suddenly makes all gender stereotypes break down and the world a happy place. Two main questions in this speech. Firstly, which side will greater affect the gender stereotype? And secondly, what are the other impacts in this debate? So on to the first one. Well, we tell you that all of their substantive material is contingent on men actually entering their fields. At third, they come up and say, oh no, we're actually contingent on the perception of men entering this field changing. Great. The perception changing is once again contingent on one student seeing that one extra man in the workplace. The perception changing is actually, like, for the perception to change, you have to see more men in these workplaces. I think so. Once again, the main core is they have to have more men entering the workplace on this side of the house. Otherwise, the majority of the impacts just frankly don't actually occur. I don't think they can like straw man this and say that, oh no, the perception will change suddenly just from this one media broadcast. Once again, simple sense check here, one media broadcast is not going to suddenly change the gender dichotomy when millions of media broadcasts from feminist movements haven't done a thing. Now, I think if we win this point, we win this debate purely off us framing, and even if you ignore all of our other substantive material. So, what have they told us? Well, they've told us that this quota will once again be a maybe single broadcast on TV once, or will be mainly known to the teachers themselves. Now, let's have a think quickly. Do you think that this is going to change the gender dichotomy? I don't think so. And why is this? Well, I think that a single broadcast has very little impact. And if it's only known to the students themselves, guess what? These students would already be studying to become like teachers, to become social workers. If it's only known these male students themselves who are already studying, wow, great. You might study a little bit harder because you're secure of a job in the future because you're sure you'll get in because of this quota. But you're already studying, so you're already going to apply for the job in the future on either side. And once again, these quotas won't actually have an impact because once again, there's no actual barriers to entry for these men. The quotas aren't eliminating any barriers to entry because frankly, there are none. If a man is qualified to become a teacher, if a man is qualified to become a social worker, he will become a social worker. It's not like the people in charge are like, oh no, we're not going to hire you because I'm a man. However, people on charge of things like engineering are like, oh, we're less likely to hire you because you're a woman. And that is what we believe is most important. So, I think that on our side of the house, we have more capital to focus more on affirmative action for women. What does this mean? Well, once again, I think there's a very marginal change in capital, and frankly, that's just because they've limited the scope of this debate so much to like a 20% quota. However, I think we still do get a marginal benefit on our side of the house of slightly more capital being spent on affirmative action for women. And once again, this affirmative action will actually have a change. If we put like a 20% quota on, say, engineering for women, I think this means more women will actually get into engineering, because if we look at the current world, if we look at the status quo, I'd say that maybe 20% of teachers currently are already male, and once again, this quota isn't actually going to attract many teachers. However, I wouldn't say that 20% of engineers are female. So if we can focus the shift onto putting these women into the jobs, this will actually do more into like dissolving the gender dichotomy. However, once again, I don't think any side really breaks the gender dichotomy all that much. However, we have a slightly more marginal change, and that is why you should vote for us. We also give you these other impacts, like the men in these workforces. The men already in this workforce will be there and they're like, oh, you already got into there only because of affirmative action. This is worse mental health for them. And the women in these workforces will be like, oh, wow, why are men suddenly why is this quota for men in a workforce? We feel like this should be our safe place. So, at the best case, more men into the workforce. And this is bad for women and bad for men. At the worst case, and at the realistic case, they actually provide no real change. And that is why I'm so proud to negate. Thank you.
You know a team has lost debate when they case shift and counter model for the first time at second, yet continue to knife that case shift down the line. 3 things in my reply today. Firstly, I'm going to whip up positive material on male stigma and career split. Secondly, I'm going to talk about female workers. Lastly, on male and female dominated fields. Okay, firstly, some whipping, right? Note here that a lot of our split material and a lot of our material on male stigmatization receives very little engagement. And note here this material was never contingent on stereotypes, so we can win on this even if you believe that everything else is a wash. One is that more men are just going to be feeling safer on outside the house and speaking out and being more vulnerable. Because when you have a guaranteed quota of 20% of men in social work, you have a guaranteed amount of men that you can actually talk to as a young man going through the social working system, which means that there are other men who know how to facilitate these discussions. How do you weigh this? You need to care about this because the patriarchy controls men as well, right? It is the lack of vulnerability. It is the strong man toxic masculinity image that makes men oppress women. We told you this impacts literally everyone. But 2, in terms of Krish's amazing split, split on how men just do not in terms of men who do not conform to heteromasculinity, right? Because it means you help these vulnerable men, you prevent these toxic stereotypes from harming these men. Their action analysis was very brief at third, and quite frankly, a little bit assertive, because misogynists will be misogynists on both sides of the house. We can win on the margins in terms of the split, right? But even if you watch the impacts of women and men in these dominated fields, these are the people you should care about, because you should weigh this on vulnerability. These are people who cannot speak up currently in society. But now that I'm going to talk about female workers, right? Know that this is probably where negating strongest materialize, and this is the only path to victory, right? In their case, is that A, affirmative action for males take away resources from female workers. There's less jobs for women and less support because resources pivot towards men. And B, they claim that female workers are in society that are very disadvantaged, and they have this weird counter model that comes at second on how there's going to be affirmative action for females in male-dominated fields. Why doesn't their case work in this debate? One, because our preemptive setup explains that leadership structures are just female-dominated. This just preempts their initial case. But two, that Krisha scales the change that quotas actually create, right? You do not need nursing to be a completely male-dominated field in order to break stereotypes. Even if you go to the doctor and 2 out of your 5 doctor visits have male nurses, it is enough to break down those implicit subconscious stereotypes, because it is what you observe in your lived experience that changes what you think about people. But 3, Krisha explains to you why women in Western liberal democracies, where this quota is more likely going to be passed, do not experience legal barriers. It is the stereotypes that they're confined by. We flip the arguments if you buy our stereotypes material. But fourthly, on the case shift comparative, right? Because their mechanism at first prevent their comparative from working. That is, in male-dominated fields, they are male-led. That is your old rich white man head engineer who hires the young attractive female worker, right? Because all of their mechanisms at first explain to you why affirmative action will not work for women in these fields, right? I.e., there's the female pressure to go into female-dominated fields anyways, right? All of their pre-existing analysis on societal structures prevent this comparative from working. And secondly, quotas already exist. It was just never mutually exclusive for women anyways. But fifthly, even if you buy that some women get locked out of nursing jobs, we still win on the outcomes of women. I'm going to whip some things here, because if we weigh it on the long term, more women are encouraged to enter other fields. They are no longer societally bound to these specific jobs when you break down the specific stereotypes of these jobs, right? We get more diversity in female-dominated fields. This benefits the whole industry, even if, this impacts every single nurse in the industry. This extends to how society views men and women and the types of jobs they fill. The scale is massive. And briefly, I'm going to talk about men in female-dominated fields. We prove to you by having quotas, you necessarily get more men into these fields. Even at our worst, where we never break down the norms, you still at least get one more male teacher. That leads to one more one more young boy believing that he can be a teacher too. That's one more young boy experiencing this sort of care and this unique sort of interaction that you can have with a male teacher that you cannot have with a female teacher. For all of those reasons, Auckland White are proud feminists.
I'd like to finish their speech, both teams for a good debate, and invite them out and shake hands across the floor.
Hagen, you should have ended your speech right there.
Good job.
That was so good, guys.
Hey, wish I feel like you.